appreciate the patience of the panelists and also your patience and endurance, I guess, is a good word. We're coming to the end of a long day and a long afternoon, and we start doing some celebration after a bit. But the people that are here have some good wisdom to need to share with us, and so we can give them the best possible attention. To get rid of one distraction from your minds, perhaps the twins won 11-5. So that distraction's gone. You don't have that question mark in your head. Margie, I'm doing every stall mechanism I can possibly figure out here. Marge? It's all yours.
Is this one that working?
Yep, it's on.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to the last session, and I know you're all tired, and we have lots of really exciting people up here that want to talk to us today. We're on the second panel of the day. The state of prejudice, a rise in violence against minority groups. Because of the time problem that we have, I'm asking each of our speakers to speak 5 to 7 minutes. If there is some time left for questions from the audience, we will do that. Father Bill assures me if we're not out of here by 6 o'clock, we're all in big trouble, so I'll do my best. You don't want to hear from me. And I think I'll just start at the end of the panel, and I will ask Larry Broadbent to speak first. Larry is the chief, hold it now, let me get his official title down here. Chief Deputy Sheriff for the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office. He's on the Idaho Human Rights Commission, and he has had lots of really interesting experiences in the Northwest with violence. Larry? Okay.
It'll be a little hard to get behind those flags, I think, on there, too. I'll try not to take up but maybe just the 5 minutes. And what I would like to address this delegation is hate crimes reporting. Nationally, we know that organized or hate crimes has been a heck of a problem, particularly for our minorities. And I think that law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and so on has been very slow in trying to address it. This was one of the particular goals for the Northwest Coalition was to institute hate crimes reporting in our 5 states. The state of Idaho right now is doing this, or will be doing it, we hope, around the first of the year on a volunteer basis. We may need more representation basically from delegates from this body, from our different task forces or other coalitions that we have around the 5 Northwest states to get some get behind law enforcement, get behind perhaps legislators, and to see whether or not we can get more people in reporting hate crime statistics. We need to designate state agencies to be responsible for this collection, whether it be Department of Law Enforcement, perhaps an Attorney General's office, or Human Rights Commission, one of the 3 certainly. We also need to have, through our task forces, I believe, and perhaps through state human rights commissions, to address those basically non-criminal complaints that you won't get on uniform crime reports. I would say that without a doubt that each one of you here has some incident in mind, either that you know of, or been a victim of, or particularly knows of somebody that's been a victim of hate crimes. And those incidents, of course, are not reported anywhere, they're not reported anywhere, and therefore they're not going to go anywhere. I would urge each one of you at the end of this meeting to go back out into our communities and try to discover a process in which hate crimes can be either reported or the collection of facts be presented to a group and then ultimately maybe to a state and then maybe to the federal government. Lenny mentioned that there are a number of hate crimes bills going through their Congress right now. At least one has passed through the House of Representatives and yet to go to the Senate. We still won't know where and who yet will gather that information. So I would just urge you to, well, what I'd like to do is not in this 5-minute forum on here, but I'd be happy to discuss some possibilities of those collections. I've given some information out and I've got a packet on uniform crime reporting, both on the law enforcement side and for human rights or task force on human relations groups that I think would be a benefit to all of us. So thank you.
I even brought my stopwatch. Under 3 minutes, I'm impressed. Next in line we have Bob Hughes, who's with the U.S. Justice Department, the Community Relations Service. He's located out of Seattle, the Region 10 office. Bob Hughes.
During the afternoon, we have been dealing extensively with the many faces of racial and religious hatred across the Northwest that we have seen arise in the last 3 to 4 years. They've ranged all the way from the Aryan nations, obviously, but the Aryan Brotherhood, the Bruderschweigen Strike Force II, on down through the Identity Churches, the Posse Comitatus, the National Socialist Vanguard of small communities like Goldendale, Washington, the Duck Club of Seattle, something of a continuum I think we've progressed across from the more formalized, obviously racially animus motivated types of organizations down to those whose significance or whose main purpose may be somewhat shrouded with a vague name and minimal publicity. These organizations, all of them that we've been discussing this afternoon, merit our careful scrutiny, our eternal vigilance. There is no way that we should minimize the fact that these organizations have located in the Northwest, in spite of the fact that some 23 persons have pled guilty or been convicted of crimes in connection with the order or the Bruderschweigen. And these 14 persons are now facing sedition charges across the country, but some of these from the Northwest. These are actions these represent prosecutions that are pending in part. We must not take any comfort in the fact that we have progressed this far. We must remain eternally vigilant as we face the rest of the challenges that we know are out there. The conditions that attracted these persons to the Northwest are still there. They haven't changed. As we have looked at these organizations, we have emphasized, I think, or seen where usually malicious harassment of racial minorities, religious minorities has accompanied their activities. They're common companions. But as we look at these organized groups, we must also realize that probably 90% of the individual incidents of racial and religious harassment in the Northwest, or racially or religiously motivated violence in the Northwest, is probably perpetrated by one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three, or one-on-four kinds of situations. Who knows what the real figures are, but the vast, overwhelming majority would be these small groups situations. Without minimizing the dangers represented by the organized hate groups with a racial or religious animus, I think we must also recognize that there is the multitude of these additional incidents, that very few of which we receive anything like regional publicity about. These are the ones that fall through the cracks time after time after time. And these should be just as much a part of our broad concern as those of the more established hate groups. Usually when a community encounters an incident of this type, we have seen in our experience the first reaction of the majority community is to deny that it ever happened. How many times have we seen this? A skepticism that anything like that ever occurred here. But when confronted with incontrovertible evidence or publicity to the effect that there's no denial of what did in fact happen in our community, then what is the usual response? After denial comes a minimization, the contention that it's isolated. Secondly, it's probably perpetrated as a prank by a juvenile, by an emotionally disturbed person, or a combination of all of these. We've seen it time and time again, and they may be valid. Those kinds of incidents those kinds of perpetrators are often involved in these kinds of incidents. However, look for just a moment at where we are placing the focus. The focus is on the perpetrator. What about the victim? We should be looking as well at the victim, the impact on the victim's family, the victim's community. This is the other side of the coin, so to speak. Especially when we look at some of the victim groups that have been common in the Northwest, I think we can all recognize the traditional targets of racist activity. But let's single out one very quickly. A common target, it's the newest and perhaps the most vulnerable target of hate group activity, whether large scale or small scale, and that's the Indo-Chinese refugee community. Here you have a community that is scattered along, certainly in the western part of our region, but there are pockets here and there scattered over virtually all of the region. These refugee communities represent persons who have a background in which any kind of collaboration, communication with the law enforcement agency is at first, it represents a great effort on the part to collaborate with law enforcement agencies. Usually in Southeast Asia, when a law enforcement officer showed up at the door of a residence of, say, a Vietnamese family, and the person was taken away, that was the last time that person was ever seen. We also must bear in mind that in this particular community, we have seen the difficulty of mastering the English language, of knowing how to file complaints, and lastly, and perhaps most important of all, significant of all, is the cultural constraints that are established in admitting that one has a problem with which they cannot cope. These are factors that none of the rest of our ethnic minority groups seem to face, at least to the same extent. So here we have a community that I think everywhere that we have a task force, a human rights commission, any of the groups within this coalition throughout the Northwest needs to be particularly sensitive to this particular community. Get those lines of liaison established with the local refugee coalition. Make certain that when those incidents occur, they're immediately responded to, and that with sensitivity that recognizes these cultural differences.
Is that it?
Thank you. I do have one more minute, and
I gave him one of mine.
okay, I took one of the previous speaker. I'd like to share very briefly with an experience of Port Angeles, Washington, one of the newest members of the coalition here. They're sitting up here on the right front. On August 1st, early in the wee hours of the morning, a Jewish owner of a business in outlying Joyce, Washington, a small unincorporated rural area, awakened to find 5-foot-high swastikas painted all along the side, the length of his building, on the outbuilding to the rear, and on the sign leading into town. By daylight, they found it around daylight, and in very short order, these signs were erased with paint remover and so on. But the press did pick it up, and it was publicized throughout that area as well as over into the Seattle area in the Post-Intelligencer. Pictures of the big swastikas and so on. To make a long story short, several days later, about 3 or 4 days later, we were able to assemble members of the Jewish community in a room, in a residence, the living room of one of the members of the Jewish community. And there we asked the question, how did these swastikas impact on you, if at all? And at first, when I posed that question, there was silence. Nobody said anything. And then finally, one person broke in and said, my parents were in the Holocaust. They never talked about it. I could only conclude by what was omitted about that phase of their life. And to think that here, I was shocked by the fact that here it's happening all over again was one of the responses. Here in Port Angeles, a second person pointed out that she'd been trying to teach her 9-year-old son how to live as a Jew in a Gentile community. What does it mean to be a Jew in this community? And then when this happened, she said that he raised the question, well, why are they doing this to us? She patiently explained to him as best she could, gave him an explanation as to why they were doing this to a Jewish-owned merchant there in the community. And after it was over, he asked the same question again. Well, why are they doing it to us? Obviously, she had no answer. These are the kinds of impacts that initially the majority community probably thought, one, these were isolated incidents, a prank, a juvenile, perpetrated by an emotionally unbalanced person, and so on. Very likely that was true. In fact, the 4 persons who were eventually arrested they did fit into this category. The point is that even though we may have the highly publicized hate groups that are in operation over the Northwest, and hopefully we will be monitoring these closely, at the same time, we must not be deluded into assuming that in the absence of this kind of activity in our local communities, that everything's okay. We must be eternally vigilant as well about these kinds of incidents as well. Even such things as what would appear to many to be a minor incident of a single swastika painted on the side of a building. That can spread havoc in a given community. Thank you.
Next, we have Ron Wakabayashi, who's the National Executive Director of the Japanese American Citizens League.
Thank you. I think under most circumstances I would feel very pressed to try and represent an Asian American community in a 5-minute presentation. And I think I have the luxury over some of the other panelists that I get to come back at noon tomorrow and go into it in more detail. And because of that luxury, I think I just want to touch briefly on 2 different aspects of what is happening in the Asian American community. One aspect is that of being an invisible minority. And if you notice, even in this conference itself, I know I'm very sensitive to the litany of groups that get listed. And we had a discussion a little earlier whether we're going to include gays and lesbians. But very often, Asian Americans and Native Americans, if you look on college campuses where they have ethnic studies, we're stuck together in a corner together because we're the others. And really, that's the category that we represent. You know, Asian Pacific Americans, Native Americans become others. And there's I guess the best way I can explain that feeling of being another is the story was my 5-year-old. I was watching a tape of the TV program Gung Ho, which I thought was just awful in terms of its stereotype and its caricature. And I said, God, that was an awful program. And my 5-year-old said, Daddy, play it again. And I said, Jay, you don't want to watch that program. That was an awful program. But Daddy, I want to see the little boy who looks like me. And it's important for us to feel reflected in the media. It's important for us to be reflected in all kinds of different ways in speech and whatever else. I remember when Gerald Ford became president right after Nixon resigned, and he came on TV, and Gerald Ford said, and I am the president of all Americans, of white Americans, of black Americans, of Hispanic Americans, and he even said Native Americans that time. And I thought, surely I'm going to hear it for the first time. The president of the United States on TV network is going to say Asian American. Gerald Ford didn't. And no president of the United States has ever said that on network TV. No president in the history of this country has ever said the word Asian American on network television in the history of this country. Now, we've been around for well over 100 years. You know, the Japanese American Citizens League celebrated the centennial in 1969 of the Japanese immigration to the United States, or the first presence. And in that time, the kind of visibility has been very low. Now, granted, I think in the last few years, that invisibility has begun to shift. And what is happening now is that rather than being invisible, the identity is that of Japan, because the Japanese economy has developed to such an overwhelming extent. You know, in 1981, trade across the Pacific exceeded trade across the Atlantic for the first time in this country's history. And so, all of us who I think are of an ethnically identifiable, physical, being, have the experience of being asked these kinds of questions like, where are you from? And people aren't satisfied when I say I'm from San Francisco. That's not the question that they're asking. And you tell them San Francisco, and afterwards you figure out they want to know ancestry. It's an ancestry question. And you give them, well, I'm of Japanese ancestry. And more often than not, you get the next response, which is, you speak English very well. And then you learn responses after a while. Well, so do you. Where did you learn? And there's a newer version of that today. The newer version is, you people make great cars. And it says, I don't like the GM products that much anymore. And they're a little bit dumbfounded by that. Because if there's a car that is a car that I would identify as you people, it might be Ford or GM. And it's not Toyota or Honda or any of those other kinds of things. But that's the presence and the growth of the Japanese and the Pacific Rim economy in particular, coupled with the liberalization of the immigration law in 1965, which has changed the face of the Asian American community in the last 20, 25 years. The liberalization of the law in 1965 has meant, like, if you look at the census figures, in 1960 there were 500,000 Asian Americans in the United States. That's a small percentage. In 1970 that number grew to 1.5 million. In 1980 the census figure had us at 3.5, and then the Population Reference Bureau in 1986 estimates that the Asian population is around 6.3 million. Now clearly it's a small population, but it's one that's rapidly growing. And we've changed from a largely an American-born population to one that is now predominantly foreign-born newcomer in its population. The consequence of that is that there's a lot of adjustment taking place, both for the Asian community having to accommodate visitors, and the other thing that I really kind of want to emphasize is that I want to kind of give you a twist. There's no such thing as an Asian American. There's no such thing as a Hispanic. I mean, you're something else before you're that. When we talk about this other category, otherwise known as Asian Pacific, we're really talking about a different range of people. Japanese Americans are 80% American-born and raised. The Chinese community is about 50-50, American-born, foreign-born. And the other Asian communities are well over 90% newcomers to this country. In its fold, you have the Lao Hmong people who are a pre-literate society, don't have a written language. On the other end, you have other Asian groups like the Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and Filipinos who represent the best educated group in the United States, have the highest rate of high school completion, and so on. But there's this perception then that we're the model minority, and you've seen that in Time magazine and Newsweek, which is really in many ways unfortunate. And one of the unfortunate parts is that some of us start believing it ourselves and think that we've made it, and we really haven't. If you examine, for example, census data, and the census says that Asian Americans are the highest median family income group in the United States. Sounds pretty good. It also develops some envy, but when you go through the data, Asian Americans are new immigrants. Asian Americans are heavily into small business, like all immigrants are, because the lack of language facility makes small business a reasonable option. So whole families are working at that grocery store 7 days a week. And we're a West Coast population. The West Coast has a higher standard of living. You take any West Coast population, compare it to a national average, that median family income is going to be higher. We take then the fact that they're in small business, and every member of that family is working 7 days a week, and you talk about median family income, yeah, it's higher. But if we broke that figure down, and we talked about the hourly rate for each person that's worked, you get a very different picture of what's in that Asian American community. It's not that portrait of success. Or if there is a view of success, what happens? If we look at universities, for example, the Auditor General in California recently completed his study. His study looked at 7 years of UC Berkeley admissions, freshmen, and looked at 7 different colleges within UC Berkeley. In 39 of those 49 groupings, Asian Americans had lower admissions rates but higher scores. On regular admissions, we're not talking about the affirmative action door though, we're talking about the regular admissions, the meritocracy door that's supposed to go just by GPA and test scores. And the University of California, Berkeley is saying, well, those figures are really not, good figures because, they counted athletes. We looked back at the athletes. Of the 600 athletes that you might use to adjust those figures, 2 were Asian Americans. So we said, go ahead and make that adjustment. We're willing to look at those figures. There's a backlash to the success. There's a perception of what in the language is overrepresentation. I've never heard in any of the prior literature when we look at civil rights in this country that there were overrepresentation of whites. That's never been stated. But all of a sudden, because we're a visible minority, there's an overrepresentation. Let me end with one example, and I just want to say that, I would want to cover in more detail that there is a growing anti-Asian violence clearly across the country. There have been, in 1986, a dozen bombings of Korean stores in the Maryland, Virginia area. A dozen Korean merchants have been murdered in South Central Los Angeles. There's conflicts going on in Houston with the fishermen, shootings in Denver around housing. But let me just give one short story about Vincent Chin. And you may have heard about Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a young Chinese American. He's about to get married. He goes to a topless bar. Maybe he shouldn't have gone there, and he certainly shouldn't have, as it turned out. 2 unemployed auto workers say, hey, you Jap, you're responsible for us not having our jobs. Fight breaks out. They break up the fight. The 2 unemployed auto workers are ejected. They hire a 3rd guy to help them wait for Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin comes up. They chase him in the car for 4 blocks. One holds him. The other takes a baseball bat and clubs him to death. Chin dies 4 days later when they pull out the life support system. The investigators did not ask one question about whether there was any racial motivation in that case. What ended up in the Vincent Chin case is his killers were given 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine payable in monthly installments. Then the U.S. Department of Justice, after considerable plotting, comes into the case. One of his killers is convicted of civil rights violations, and that's reversed later on in the Cincinnati court. Mrs. Chin, through all that time, Mrs. Chin is an immigrant, and Vincent was working 2 jobs. He was working in a Chinese restaurant, and then he was working in an auto industry-related activity. So he's part of really the auto industry in many ways. Mrs. Chin, through that whole trial, says, I want justice for my son. I want justice for Vincent. And she went through this long series of trials from his death in 1981 to the more recent, final trial that ended earlier this year. Mrs. Chin went to visit China after all this completed, and Mrs. Chin is not coming back. It's, and I know that Danny and Mako can tell you the story about the internment, but I think for all of us, I think what we need to understand that human rights, civil rights, has a very serious and fundamental impact in terms of the way people feel in their lives. I started off talking about my 5-year-old. And all of us who have kids know how important that is to us. When someone said to him in that sandbox at the San Francisco Zoo, this sandbox is for white kids only, and we heard that little voice come out of that sandbox, his mother and I went running off and said, who said that? And we saw another little kid sitting there, and we went looking for the parents. And we talked about it. On the way home, we saw graffiti next door to our house that said, "Chinks and Jews suck." And you see this thing constantly, and it wears at you. This kind of a constant level of anxiety that you carry around, you can't really relax. I think in the most subtlest form, in the everyday form, it's kind of like feeling like you don't really belong. When someone says you speak English very well, they're really saying you look like you don't speak English very well. You look like you don't really belong here. And under the best circumstances, it's like being a guest. And no matter how kind the host, you can't put your feet on the table, you can't walk around in your underwear. You can't feel at home. And, I think that's the important part of it, that Asian Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, white Americans, black Americans, that we all need to be able to feel like we can walk around in our underwear because this is home for us. Thank you.
At the conference, is that what you're saying? Good. Glad we did it here. Next, we have Bill Gladden, who's the Executive Director of the Washington State Human Rights Commission.
I had an awful lot to say, and I'm not going to get a chance to say it, so I guess I'll do the best I can with my 7 minutes. I don't know how you feel, having been here these few days, but I'm a little bit awed and a great deal impressed. And I'm not easily impressed. I worked in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. I've been working in civil rights since 1965. And I met the Klan in Southside, Virginia in 1965. They were burning crosses and shooting into the president's home, president of the NAACP's home, during a voter registration drive. And it hasn't left me since. But I'm excited at the same time because I think that in the state of Washington, and I'm not comparing Washington with other states, but we have a law that I think is absolutely magnificent for what I have been hearing and for what we started out to try to accomplish better than a year ago. And I want to read just a little bit of it for you. And it's in chapter 4960 of the Revised Code of Washington. And this chapter shall be known as the Law Against Discrimination. It is an exercise of the police power of the state for the protection of the public welfare, health, and peace of the people of this state, and in fulfillment of the provisions of the Constitution of this state concerning civil rights. And then he goes on to recite the areas covered. And the next sentence I want to read is that a state agency is herein created with powers with respect to elimination and prevention of discrimination. And it lists the other items that were referred to earlier. And it is the elimination and prevention of discrimination that I want to make a few comments about. The way that we address those two areas of responsibility is through the compliance side, which handles the investigations that we receive based on charges and complaints. The elimination side is handled by a special programs group that provides technical assistance and education and does those things that I think we're going to have to begin to address and try to do relating to the communities throughout the state of Washington. Our commissioners, we have 5 commissioners, and they are selected from around the state. We have our meetings once a month in a different part of the state. And you will be surprised what you learn when you get out into the different towns and you take your show to the people and they come in and talk with you. You really hear what's going on. And you realize that the scope of what we have to do is bigger than all of us. I was thinking about some of the things that I could tell you that have happened since I've been director of the commission. But I believe what I need to do is say to you that there are some concerns that I have. And the concerns that I have, I hope you can understand, come from having experienced dearth of new ideas and thinking about how we address the civil rights concerns in this country. And I want to begin by saying that I have always felt that the law is on the books, they are there to be enforced, and if a person says that I can't do my job because of this administration or the other administration, you should challenge him. We should all challenge him because they're being paid to enforce the law. And it is not an administration policy that says a person can't do their job in the regional offices, in the district offices, or in the state government. We are supposed to be accountable, and we need to demand that. If we leave here and go back to wherever we came from, and we don't begin to do what Robbie said, which is to challenge the peers. You talk to the peers about what they are doing and what they're supposed to do. That's as much a part of what we're supposed to do as it is to investigate charges, as it is to make speeches and to put on seminars. And that's really matching your walk with your talk. And I think that there are some things that we need to keep in mind from here. And the first one I said is we have an obligation to chart a course for this organization that is guided by wisdom and reason with due regard for individual freedoms. You might wonder why I say that. The reason I say that is because it's relatively simple to deal with an overt act. You find out who did it, you get the evidence to support it, and you enforce whatever laws there are against it. But when you begin to get into the area that we've been talking about for the last couple of days, which is prejudice and bigotry, you're talking about attitudes, you're talking about actions and results that will be manifested by seemingly innocent procedures, practices, and corporate or institutionalized behavior. And that requires a great deal more discipline. It requires a great deal more preparation. And I think that we all need to think about the fact that if we are not careful when we begin to deal with attitudes, that we may very well wind up being part of the problem rather than the solution. Because you have to consider the fact that there are some private thoughts, there's some private biases and prejudices that may not ever rise to the level of an overt act. But I believe that in our experience, we know that there are instances where we can be challenged to take a stand, and we don't have to look for anyone else to do it. And I think those are the places that we need to address when we return. The other area that I wanted to mention, the leadership and membership in this organization must recognize the great potential and to exercise vigilance, as someone said here earlier, and responsible debate to ensure that this organization remains consistent with the original mission and objectives, because if we are not careful, we will have created something here that we might regret in the future. I just want to close by saying one thing. What disturbed me recently was, as long as I've been in civil rights, you think some things are almost taken for granted. We got a couple of complaints from an area in the state where it was about Halloween, and it's coming up next week. And you know, young people wear costumes, they have parties, and a couple of costumes were Klan costumes. This was not at one school, but more than one. And there was a complaint filed, and we investigated it. The tragedy of it all was that the school officials, first of all, wanted to deny that they were Klan costumes. It was anything but what it purported to be. And secondly, they felt that it was all innocent, but they gave the prize to the children who wore the Klan costumes. Were they sending a message? This is the kind of thing that is quite disturbing today, so many years after the Civil Rights Act. We had another case where a coach in high school made some disparaging remarks about Hispanic members of the team. We got the complaint from a person who was not the father of the child who had been embarrassed by this, but another person. And we investigated that. The tragedy in that case is that the school officials first said, we can't do anything because we don't have any procedures or policy about this. Do you need policy for things like this today? Well, we finally got the matter resolved. They didn't want to put a letter in the man's file. They didn't want to provide training in the school district. So we wound up referring the case to the Attorney General's office. And that's where we got results. And that case has been resolved. But this is what I think is so relevant to what you've been talking about here today. That is that we're talking about attitudes that give rise sometimes, eventually, to certain overt actions and behavior. And those attitudes can best be addressed with the community's involvement and the community's recognition that we do have a problem. And I think this coalition here is just a magnificent undertaking. And I don't want to minimize it at all. And I think that if we appear to be serious about it, I indeed want to say to you that it is serious business indeed. Thank you.
Next is Rosalind Borg, who is Executive Director of the Portland chapter of the American Jewish Committee.
I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. It's late. I know we're all stiff and tired of sitting. We've heard some really fine speakers. Before I came out here to Oregon, I was in the garbage business. I'm now a human relations specialist, and quote, I'm still in the garbage business. Bigotry and discrimination, racism are a far more invasive, pervasive form of garbage than anything that I ever dealt with. Now, I don't consider myself an expert on racial violence. I don't count the number of incidents. I don't have the staff to count them in Portland. And I don't really care. I don't care whether there's one incident, whether there's 10 incidents, or whether there's 100 incidents. And I don't care whether there's 10 victims or whether there's 100 victims. If there's one, that's one too many, and that's an increase in violence. I think there's a few givens that we need to keep in mind when we talk about racial violence. I think we can all agree that violence has always accompanied prejudice. That following the Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement, we saw a definite decline in the depth of prejudicially motivated violence. And the third given is that in the last few years there have been some very highly publicized incidents of violence. Whether this means there's an increase or that we're more aware of what's going on, because these incidents are so unexpected, Whether they're isolated or whether they're a part of a pattern, I don't know. In Oregon, we have not been immune. We've had our incidents of violence. And what concerns me most is that in addition to the physical act of church and synagogue vandalism, of cemetery desecrations, of distribution of ugly literature, of bigoted statements directed toward our Jewish governor, what concerns me most is the perception that bigoted thoughts and behavior are gaining acceptance, that it's suddenly becoming okay in very nice circles to silently sympathize with overt and covert bigotry. And my first and only experience with violence occurred right here in Coeur d'Alene last April. I came up here to sign the Articles of Incorporation for this coalition. We met in the morning. We ironed out some of our differences. We got ready to come over to the college. I got in the car. I don't remember who was driving, Bill maybe, Wasmuth or Tony, doesn't matter. And as we approached the campus, I noticed every so many feet, Larry Broadbent had his men out there. There was a uniformed officer wherever you looked, in the parking lot, on the campus, and as we walked into the building and into the auditorium. And I was really surprised. I'm thinking, what are all these officers doing here? What's going on? And so I turned to somebody and I said, "Did you ever see so many officers in one place?" I mean, you can't imagine how incredibly naive I was. I said, "Did you ever see so many officers? What are they doing here?" And the person said to me, "You dummy, they're here because we're here." And I said, "Because we're here? But we haven't done anything wrong." And he said, "No, they're here to protect us in case something goes wrong." I want to tell you that I was so angry in my life, in all the communities I've lived in. I never felt afraid to walk any place or to do anything. Yes, I knew there was violence, and yes, I knew there was prejudice directed against me because I was Jewish. I was grateful to Larry and to his force for being there, but I was very sad, and I was very angry, and all I could think about was so few ugly people amidst this beautiful, beautiful country, and that we have to deal with that kind of garbage today. The perpetrators of racial violence, I think as Bob Hughes said earlier, when they're caught, they can be handled through the law enforcement process. But it's the perception that needs to be addressed. It's my concern about the silent sympathizers among the well-educated middle class, and even within ethnic circles themselves, that needs to be addressed. And as long as that perception that bigotry is okay, that you can publicly say one thing and privately in the midst of your friends say something else, as long as that perception is there, then the reality will find fertile ground. Thank you.
Linda Taylor was unable to be with us today, and instead we were able to get James Holm, who's president of the Washington Privacy Lobby. He also is a representative on the board of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Jim?
Let's just.
Well, I'm delighted to be here today. I'm proud to be here on this panel with so many distinguished people who've talked about the specific issues as they relate to themselves and their groups. I was especially proud to be a part of the passage of the resolution we just passed an hour or so ago. I just want to say thank you to Mary Devlin and the folks who worked with her to put that together today. Because as I walked into this conference and I read the bylaws and I looked at the literature, I realized my population isn't recognized, only indirectly. But I'm here to talk about the incidence of anti-gay violence and harassment that goes on with gays and lesbians across this country. It's very real. It's been the reality of my life and many other people's lives. And I hope that we all come together to recognize that and incorporate this as we look at bylaws again next year. I want to start out with a little anecdote that just happened this morning. Got up this morning in my apartment in Seattle, got ready, called a cab to go to the airport. It's a fairly long drive from Capitol Hill to SeaTac Airport. And the cab driver asked me where I was going. They always do when you're going to the airport. And I said, well, I was going to Coeur d'Alene. And he said, well, what in the world are you going to Coeur d'Alene for on a Saturday morning? So I explained to him about the conference. And he said, well, what's your involvement? So I told him that I was representing the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. He said, you know, I've had some real experience in this area. You have. He had been walking in one of Seattle's parks just during the past year in the evening when a gang of around 6 young men approached him, began yelling anti-gay epithets at him, telling him that all you queers had brought AIDS upon yourselves, and proceeded to severely beat him up. Eventually, the police arrived. They questioned him. They asked, the first questions they had of him were, how did he bring this on himself? The next thing the cab driver told me was that he's heterosexual. He said, I understand what you're doing over there. Go over there and give him hell. In 1983, I was elected to the presidency of the Dorian Group, which is Washington State's oldest and largest lesbian and gay rights organization. Shortly after that, the National Gay Task Force asked me if Seattle would participate as one of 10 cities in which an initial attempt to document anti-gay violence could take place. We agreed. That summer, we collected surveys from 478 people in Seattle to learn about harassment with gays. We know it's out there. We've lived it all our lives, but no one had any numbers. So we did the surveys, and I just wanted to share a few results. The survey results were almost identical across America in the cities where this was done. 90% had experienced verbal harassment. 48% had had threats of violence. 25% had been punched, kicked, or beaten. 8% had been assaulted with a weapon. These are mostly members of the Dorian Group and people who showed up at a gay pride march. I think those numbers speak for themselves. A good friend of mine, Kevin Barrell, works for the National Gay Lesbian Task Force and has sought to do some definitional work on anti-gay violence. And I want to quote Kevin. I don't do this very often, but his quote is that violence is anti-gay when it is directed against persons or their property because they are lesbian or gay or perceived to be so. My cab driver. They are associated with or advocate on the behalf of gay and lesbian people. By this definition, victims and perpetrators of anti-gay violence can be anyone, heterosexual or gay, young or old, male or female, strangers or acquaintances. Kevin also goes on to talk about what are the causes of anti-gay violence. The incidents documented in the report I'm reading from and countless other attacks are motivated by irrational fear and hatred and by the perception that gay people are easy targets, unable to fight back, unwilling to risk exposure by reporting crimes to the police. Unfounded and persistent notions that gay and lesbian people are sick, sinful, or predatory have fostered the hostility that leads to anti-gay violence and have slowed official recognition and response to the problem. The stereotypes that people carry about gay and lesbian people are what causes the violence to happen to gay and lesbian people and for them to promote it against us. I want to just walk you through a few incidents of anti-gay violence to give you a flavor of its reality. Probably the most famous in the last decade was the assassination of Mayor George Moscone and Harvey Milk in San Francisco in 1979, when Supervisor Dan White, upset over his non-reappointment to a seat, shot and killed both of them. I had occasion to see the life and times of Harvey Milk, and I would recommend every one of you go to the video store, check it out, and see it. When Dan White's verdict came down, Dan White got less than 5 years altogether for 2 assassinations. Dan White was eventually released in California, and they couldn't figure out where to put him because they were so afraid for his personal safety, given the hate crime he'd committed. In 1982, more than 25 New York City police officers entered Blues, a Manhattan black and Latino gay bar. They assaulted patrons with nightsticks and clubs and ransacked the bar interior, causing extensive damage. In 1983, yelling "diseased faggot," a gang of teenagers assaulted a gay man on the streets of Seattle and raped him with a crowbar. I met that young man. He has never been the same. At Halloween that year, I went out to one of my favorite bars, places of entertainment, and just had this notion that maybe I don't want to be here tonight. I didn't know what it was. There's a spot in the bar where I always stood and chatted with my friends, and it was near this door where the air would come in because it would get hot in there. That night I walked in, stood there for just a few minutes, and decided, no, I think I'm going to go home tonight. So I did. The next morning, I had phone calls from friends. Not more than 2 or 3 minutes after I had pulled away, someone drove by down the alley and shot a gun blindly into exactly where I would have been standing that night. And that premonition was all that has me here tonight. Someone was shot and someone was killed as a product of that incident. There are many other incidents on this list, but I'm not going to read them all to you. In addition to this violence against gays and lesbians, we're now looking at the major epidemic of this century, the AIDS epidemic. 5 years ago, there were 5 cases of AIDS in Seattle. Today, there are 475 cases. In 5 years, there will be 4,000 cases in Seattle, 5,000 in Washington State. Accompanying this epidemic are radical increases in anti-gay violence. In 1985, in San Francisco, one of the centers of this epidemic, that year alone, the number of cases of anti-gay violence reported increased 50%. The next year in New York City, the number of cases of anti-gay violence increased 83%. There are 2 epidemics out there. One epidemic is the AIDS epidemic. The other epidemic is the anti-gay violence that accompanies it. We know a lot less about the latter. You learn about it only within the gay community, and in the rare times that this is picked up in the major media. We can only guess what will take place in the future. Let me just give you a small anecdote. My lover makes masks. They're decorative, they're wearable art. He ships them out around Halloween time around the country. A good friend of his was to be a recipient of one of these masks who lives in Nevada. I talked to him from Washington, D.C., where I was at the march a couple weeks ago, and he had just boxed up the mask. He called to get the correct address, got the sister, and the sister said, "You don't know?" Since Anthony had talked with his friend merely 3 weeks ago, he died of pneumocystis carinii, which is a form of pneumonia that people die of from AIDS. It's all around us. I've lost 13 friends. 2 years ago, I stopped counting. What can be done? We've heard some today about a bill in the U.S. House of Representatives, H.R. 3193. That bill, the National Gay Lesbian Task Force has been working on in cooperation with the American Jewish Congregation, the APA, a Lutheran organization, and the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism. That bill, as we heard earlier during the discussion of the resolution, was passed out of committee, and the amendment which added sexual orientation won out over the amendment that deleted sexual orientation. This would be the first time that we would have a federal measure which would require the collection of this kind of data. The collection of this kind of data is incredibly important. Most people who are gay and lesbian live lives in the closet. Very, very few of us do what I do, which is to be open, to speak out, to be on television, to be on radio. Most people live a life of fear. And that means that you don't know they're gay. There are gay people in this room sitting at the tables with you who haven't told you. They're afraid to tell you. They may tell me later if they see me alone later tonight, but they won't tell you. They're afraid to lose their jobs. They're afraid of the violence that will result. My time is up. So I want to read just one quote from Barney Frank, who's one of 2 congressmen in the U.S. Senate who has come out as a gay person. He and Jerry Studs, both from Massachusetts. I don't know what that's about, but his comment is that any bill which ignores anti-gay violence is dangerous and leaves gays as the most vulnerable and victimized and group and tacitly endorses crimes against gays. Barney's comments were around the debate as to whether sexual orientation was in the hate crimes bill. I hope we all take that to heart as we look at incorporating an understanding that the Nazis killed 500,000 gays as well as the Jews and the Gypsies. And it's a crime against all of us as we deal with their neo-Nazi new generation. Thank you.
Not listed in your program, but we have a couple of additions to the panel that I think you'll find interesting. We have Henry Sijon from the Coeur d'Alene tribe.
You'll have to forgive me because I realize that this is quite an imposition upon you, inasmuch as I'm going to keep you up all hours of the afternoon. And the second thing is I may infringe upon your happy hour. I have sat here through some of these sessions with very mixed emotions. Very definitely, when we were privileged to be put on a panel, we accept the privilege very graciously. However, it would have been much nicer if we were included in the agenda in the very early part of the morning. But I want to give you the impression right now that I am here. I feel quite qualified. I've spent 27 years in the classroom. I have a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Idaho. I have a master's degree from Gonzaga University. And I am a retired professor of American Indian Studies. I know that members of the task force, like Marshall Menz and Father Bill, you know, I walked the same oxen tracks with the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations a time or two. And the impact of this is yet to be ascertained. However, this opportunity to talk to all of you today is something that I relish very much. So I feel very comfortable in the fact that I'm with the Krauts, the Wop, the Dago, the Jap, the Chink, the Kike, the Nigger, the Polak, the Swede, the Spick, the Beaner, the Honky, and even the Redneck. We must keep in mind that our heritage of the American Indian, we say Indian. However, the origin is still as yet up for grabs and a great question mark. We know of our individual tribes as we refer to them by name, whether we are the Chichums, the Sinjumena, the Saaptan, the Sinchumtsi, and so forth, the Yakmas. So that we have been ascertained to have been a people that originated and crossed over the land bridge, or even as far as being one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Very definitely, we, as Indian tribes, traditionally have proclaimed ourselves, and we do believe in what is referred to as the polygenetic theory. We believe that there is more than one Adam and Eve, that the Creator put us here, put us on this continent, developed our culture, our language, our government, and our traditions, customs, with oceans apart from the European and the Eastern nations of this earth. And yet, we believed in the Almighty, and we believe in the dignity of man, and we believed in a lot of things that as yet have to be divulged and credited to the American Indian. When the white man came, I think we made a mistake, you know, because you have to consider that Christopher Columbus was an Italian from Genoese. He was a Genoese, but he was in the service of Spain. So we definitely take no credit in his discovering of us. We discovered him. And we accepted him by sharing with him and his people our virtues, our culture, our land, our women, our families, and as a result, the European imposition of culture predicated upon the dollar created problems for both people because land became the big dollar sign. It resulted in wars where we sold and gave up lands because of the fact that we believed there was land enough for all. Everything from trinkets to through the cause of liquor. As I look upon it and make the analyzation that there has been a methodical disenfranchisement of the Indian people, and it is predicated upon the contrived guise of legality. And that includes federal and state laws. Because I see that the Indian now is under several laws. The American Indian is under federal law, is under state law, is under the Bureau of Indian Affairs law, and under tribal law. So that when the treaties were made, they were made for the purpose of expediency. It was the best thing at the time to do it. It created Indian wars. It created the peace policy of President Grant. It created what is referred to as Manifest Destiny, which was originated by President Jefferson. And the purpose of this was a policy utilizing the American Board of Missions to send missionaries out to pacify the Indians so that they will not be warlike, so that the American people, when they came in, could take over the land. When the territories were established, like the Oregon Territory, it was established by a missionary and a farmer. Originated in a barn. And they sent eventually through the coalition of individuals, the missionary Marcus Whitman on his long ride to Washington, D.C. in 1843 to talk to the Congress of the United States to open up this land, to give each man one section of land and a woman, which would be his wife, another section of land. It's no wonder that they shipped the women out here by the stagecoach, and there were quite a few of them. The Oregon Territory was established in 1849, and the giving up of land to the individuals that settled in Oregon Territory was passed in what was called the Indian Donation Act of 1849. A year later, in 1850, the Congress of the United States said, hey, we made a mistake. We didn't come to any agreement of establishing treaties with those tribes east of the Mississippi or west of the Mississippi. So then they formulated what was called the Indian Reservation Act in 1850. Put the Indians on reservations and then open up the land to settlement. So that this created problems, because now there isn't a reservation that exists today that belongs to a single reservation or tribe. It's a conglomerate of tribes. Unknown to many of you, perhaps, that the guidelines, the establishment of the Constitution of the United States as studied by Benjamin Franklin, and in between his journeys to the houses of ill repute, he did study the Iroquois Confederacy. And I, as an individual Indian, somewhat an individual that feels that our world has changed. You know, our women used to wash our face, braid our hair, take care of us, cook our meals, and we had a good life. It was understood, you know, between the men and the women. But then when it came to the franchise, it kind of galls me a little bit, because we never got the franchise until 1924. But the United States gave the franchise to the foreigners that came from Europe, to the Orientals that came from Asia, to the blacks that came from Africa. And what is most galling of all was that they gave the franchise to the women before they gave it to the Indian people. So being a chauvinist Indian, you know, that's pretty hard to take. One of the great deficits that the federal government has failed with the American Indian, besides education, besides upholding the terms of the treaty, and besides recognizing the sovereignty of the tribes, is the factor of consultation. They didn't ask us if we wanted to share this land. They passed the laws in Washington, D.C., and they came out here by the droves, took over our lands, established the treaties. Yes, it is true that we have gone from non-consultation to the factor that now in the 20th century they are considering talking with the tribal groups so that consultation may come eventually. But let's face a fact. We speak about institutional racism. Every one of us here as individuals, we all have that bias. We all have that prejudice. And we all look upon the other sometimes with a little tinge of suspicion. We have heard the record time and time and again by presidents-elect that we are going to do right by the Indians, that we're going to recognize their treaty rights, or we're going to recognize their sovereignty, we're going to recognize Indian self-determination, whatever it is. We've seen it, we've heard it, and nothing has changed. Sure, we speak about harassment. We've been harassed. We've been killed, too. We've been hung. We've been shot at. I've had my grandmother tell me as a young girl in the last war of 4 Lakes, just south of the city of Spokane, when all of the Indians were herded from Spokane clear up to Cataldo. And as the entourage of Indians were walking, the military men played tag with the people. They would run their horses right through the whole herd. If they maimed them, killed them, so what? They upheld the theory that General Philip Sheridan, when an Indian walked up to him and said, I'm a good Indian, and he told the Indian, the only good Indian I've seen are dead. We have today many things that we are concerned with. Sovereignty rights, one of the greatest deficits, and things that we really are fighting for is the consideration of our history, Indian history and culture, to be included in the textbooks. And I hope that someday this group will assist the Indian tribes in getting an Indian educator on the textbook commissions of the states of Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, so that we can contribute then to the textbook. Like, for example, in the state of Idaho, the approved textbook only has about a paragraph on the Nez Perce tribe, a little larger paragraph on the show bands, just a few lines on the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and mention of the Kootenays. You don't get to know the Indians by watching them war dance or play stick game. You've got to talk with them. You've got to learn and to see where they are philosophically, intellectually, and recognize the contribution that the American Indian made in all of these fields, including medicine, diet, exercise, so that everything that has been established that you hear about today, treaties and so forth, I'll have to admit, you know, our problems today originated with the coming of the Englishman or Columbus or whoever it was, maybe the Swede, Leif Erikson. We should have annihilated that man, or the first man that put his leg over the gunwale of that boat, so that maybe we could have eliminated many of our problems. But the Indian has survived 400 years of imposed cultures. We have survived 200 plus years since the formulation of the United States. And I assure you that the Indian will survive, because we take a great deal of pride in our tribal identity, in our culture, and our traditions. And the advocacy that might makes right definitely does not hold with the American Indian. And as you know, and I can prove it, that the moral law is second best to the almighty dollar in the American scene. The conscience of America, when it comes to the American Indian, is practically nil. And as was mentioned this morning by His Excellency, that the soul of America has not been redeemed. So you are going to, in the future, negotiate with the Indian people. But let me tell you one fact. When you associate with him and talk with him or her, the Indian will look at you, and he will look in your eyes. She will look into your eyes, because the old Indian philosophy is that your eyes are the windows to your soul. The reservation is the last frontier. We have a great deal of natural resources, timber, grain, minerals, fishing, hunting, tourism, all of these things. And we can help and assist you a great deal. But you must accept us. Through your intellectual perceptibility, my appeal is to you in this way for understanding. I don't wish to reclaim the lands which you occupy and which you enjoy today. But I want you to think of one thing. The lands and property which you now own and enjoy today was at one time all of ours. The Indians have accepted your language, your interests, and even your culture. You must reciprocate through your knowledge, by gaining knowledge, and establish an awareness which will lead to understanding. And we will cooperate with you. But respect us and uphold, as is preached by many of our Christian leaders, the dignity of man. I bleed like you do, and I have feelings like you. The Kootenai County Task Force can remember my statement concerning the respect for everyone. I want to remain Indian. I was born an Indian, and I will remain an Indian till the very last breath that I take. So don't think about the melting pot theory. We're never going to melt together because there's going to be some bias and prejudice interfere. But accept me, perhaps, as a carrot in that stew pot. You might be a potato. You might be the meat, the rutabagas, or whatever. But we'll make a delectable dish if we work together and cooperate. We may have intellectual disputations and repartee, but my appeal to you is for the recognition and acceptance of our rights. When you consider that there are over 350 federally recognized tribes, over 1 million American Indians today, it is true that our political clout may be somewhat limited, but we can sway the pendulum in a good direction. And we want you to consult with us and to talk this over in the political representation that's going to be coming up in the next election. My last and final appeal to you is you can accept us as we have accepted you. You can look upon the reservations as maybe a foreign land or unknown to you now. But remember, there are certain jurisdictional rights that you have to become acquainted with. And you may, at some time in the future, you should try and deal with us now, because in the future, you may have to deal with us in a legal way. Thank you.
I realize that it is 6 o'clock and Father Bill is standing back there telling me I'm in big trouble. We have one more panel member, and I would very much like to hear from him. And I think you would too. If we can realize we have some real short time here, I hate to put that restriction on you, but can you please talk to us anyway? We have here Chief Johnny Jackson from the Mid-Columbia River. Mr. Jackson, would you like to come here? Okay, I'm sorry to cut you short.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chief John Jackson, one of the 4 chiefs of the Columbia River tribes. We've traveled up here on their short notice. We've been busy along the Columbia as we've had many problems. I'm thankful to be here to listen to a lot of the concerns that I'm hearing here today, as we are struggling with a lot of our concerns along the Columbia River, over land base, over rights, over treaty issues. Along with our people, we are having difficulties over a lot of the reserved rights that we've had, and which was reserved for us during the making of the treaties. We have people who are sitting behind bars today because of our traditional ways of life that did not want to change. We have people suffering right across the borderline here in Spokane that's getting a stroke, a religious leader. Maybe you've heard of him. He was known, became known nationally wide. He's been known in Europe for what's been happening to him because of a struggle over an issue, a fishing issue. We are a river people. We're part of the 14 bands of the Yakima Nation. We became Yakimos by name and by number as part of the government policy and part of the way that the United States government feels that what we have and what is ours, that he should be able to take over by saying that by name of Yakima, that we are to be removed from the river and moved on to the reservations. When the treaties were made of June 9th, 1855, our people would not leave the river because it was our land. All our heritage was the river. Our food, our culture, our sacred lands, everything that was there was a part of us, and we were a part of it. Hearing what the speaker before me had just said was great. I've traveled across this country since the time that my people start being arrested and harassed for fishing. The ocean fishery got carried away, the Alaskan fishing got carried away. The dams weren't adequately equipped for passage of the fish, and the fish dwindled. That caused a great strain on the people in the state of Oregon and Washington. Even here in Idaho, you enjoy the steelhead, the sports fishing. But the native people have unwritten laws and ways of life and culture along the river that they've never forgotten. Solalo was one of the 7 wonders of the world, where people came from across the ocean that heard about it, across the nation, to see Solalo and see the only all-Indian fishery on the mighty Columbia River, to watch them fish and dry their fish. Today, that's just nothing but a big pool. And the village of Solalo, where Chief Howard Jim comes from, is only a big pool in a little village, forgotten. The Yakima Nation is in Washington on one side. The Warm Springs Nation is on Oregon on the other side, Umatilla to the east. At one time, all these tribes and the people from up here, up the coast, would all gather at Solalo. It was a big gathering place. They'd have a feast when the first coming of the fish, and then from there on, the chief would tell them that they can go ahead and start gathering and harvesting their fish for the rest of the year. That was part of our unwritten laws and our culture. Today, we're fighting for that culture, to keep that culture and that traditional way that we have. Today, we have men sitting in prison for exercising that right and that way of life. I travel wherever there's trouble. I don't get paid for it because I'm a chief. I've been elected, I wasn't elected. I was put in my place as the chief through an inherited right, through my grandfather. My uncle is the head chief. I'm his assistant, sub-chief. Howard Jim is the Solalo chief on the Columbia River. We've traveled many places and spoke. We have many friends. We've been in Canada. I've been all the way back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Wherever I've gone, I witnessed and heard the problems of harassment and trouble against the red man. The man that sits in a jail over here across the border here in Garfield, he and his whole family along the Columbia River witnessed and experienced a raid 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning by federal officers and state officers while they were still sleeping in bed with their families. They were drug out at gunpoint, and they called that a SWAT team. They were gathered in a circle and their houses raided, looking for fish. All their dried fish and their winter supply that they were putting up was drug out and thrown on the ground. They were looking for weapons. They didn't even give them a chance to put their clothes on. And they held them out there at gunpoint to search them and look for fish. They gathered them all up and cited them for illegal fishing. And they took whatever they could find that they felt was a weapon. You know, and I went to the service against the will of my grandfather, Chief Slockish of the Klickitats. And I donned that uniform. I was taught to do that. I was trained to do that, to fight in a surprisingly way, in a quick way, to attack. But I never got to go overseas to fight and use those tactics. I almost died in the States. I watched men die around me where I was at because there was an epidemic broke out. Many of the boys didn't have to go overseas to earn a medal at that time. They died before they even finished basic training. And it was a bad thing for me to see. I came home and it was like the words came true of my grandfather, that through the treaty that he carried of his great-grandfather of June 9th, 1855 at Walla Walla, that we were never to raise arms again, that our rights and reserved rights, our food and everything was guaranteed, that we'd reserve them for as long as the sun rose and the river flowed and the mountains stood. And we'd never see the day that we'd suffer this harassment of having state officers and federal officers sitting across the river up on a bank or up on a highway behind some bush or some tree, watching us with night scopes, see if we're doing anything wrong, and coming down and searching some of our boys to see if they're fishing. A lot of this that I am witnessing today. Chief Howard Jim, where he lives, state officers stormed across into that tribal land with state cars and raced round through the village and stopped to start looking through the buildings to see if they had any fish, see if they were doing wrong. These are the things that we're witnessing today over the food that is sacred to us, food that is ours. Today is called game fish. The water that is first in our religion and on our tables is being fought over today on the reservations of the Yakima Nation and throughout the area, a water right issue, which we've never seen before. These are the things that I've come up here and I travel to speak on, that I feel is very bad and wrong. The Constitution, what is the Constitution? Where is that guaranteed right? What makes us so different? Where is that reserved right that Buchanan signed when Governor Stevenson went back to Washington when the treaties were made? The reserved rights. These are the things that I'm traveling for today as a chief. My people, the Indian people, on both sides of the river, we're not on the reservation, where we've always been. My people are very important to me. At one time, I thought that money would be. But the very words that my grandfather spoke, that one day your people are going to be more important than money to you. And today, that day has came. I've been a chief for a little over a year now, and I found out that my people are more important to me than anything in this world. That's why I'm here. That's why I travel today, to ask that somehow that justice and justification can come for us to justify what's happening to my people, and their reserved rights and guaranteed rights and our foods be recognized, in our religion, our traditional ways. I'll leave you with one word, that somehow that you can look at the things that are happening to the black people, the Chinese, the Japs, and the other people, that somehow that this justification can be brought forth and be based upon the words of the Constitution and all those things that were brought before us before, to be made realize that your forefathers made them. Do not be forgotten now and overlooked, because in time of war, your kids and some of you are going to be asked to participate in that. There's going to be no discrimination then. There's going to be no looking away from you then. You're going to be the one that's going to be called the American man that has to stand up, or the woman that has to stand up to defend his country. So think about that. I think about it all the time when I look at my neighbors, the gorge bill, what's affecting my neighbors, the people that I grew up around, went to school with. They're my neighbors. They never came from anywhere. When I was born, I got old enough to know them. They were my parents' neighbors. But today they're being threatened because the gorge has to become a playground and be changed. That's threatening our land, and our communities, our resources. We're struggling today to hang on to that. It's ours. So I thank you for listening to me.